So, welcome everybody to Diversity School London's webinar this evening. My name is Lydia Harrison, MW. I'm an educator at the school in London and also host our events program and organise our events. And obviously, over the last year and a half, they have very much gone virtual. And we've been doing a whole host of webinars, which you can see previous ones on our YouTube channel or via our website. And we've done a whole Discover series, so different grape varieties, different regions, different countries. And we have recently partnered with Wine Australia to specifically look at grape varieties in Australia. So I previously did a webinar on Australian Pinot Noir. We have Emma Symington, MW, who works for Wine Australia tonight to take you through Riesling and the best areas in Australia for Riesling. And equally going forwards, in the autumn, we'll also be taking a look at Shiraz in Australia. So please do tune in for that as well if you want to know more about Australian grape varieties. So thank you very much for joining us. And without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Emma Symington, MW, who is going to take you on a journey of Australian Riesling. So thank you, Emma.
Thanks so much, Lydia, and hello. Thank you all for joining us on this evening. It's really nice for you all to be here, and I'm really pleased to be presenting. So as Lydia said, I am Emma Symington, MW. I became an MW, nearly 6 years ago now. And for my day job, I work for Wine Australia. So we're the promotional body for Australian wine. Obviously, the head office is over in Australia, but I'm based here in the UK. Our office usually is in London, but currently I'm still working from home and I live down in Sussex. So you've got all my details there. Do contact me via Instagram, Twitter, or send me an email at any point if you ever want. I'm always willing to be contacted. And my particular role within Wine Australia is Education Development Manager. Our office actually covers EMEA, so fully across Europe, Middle East and Africa. Though it has to be said, the predominant amount of my work is in the UK and Europe. Just really going out to trade and talking to people about Australian wine, letting people know a bit more about the diversity of Australia, talking about the regions and the climates and the grape varieties and so on, and getting people knowing a bit more about Australian wine. So that's why I'm here today, to talk about Australia and one of my favourite grape varieties, Riesling. So I'm really excited to be talking about Riesling today. Now, just to point out before we crack on with the actual presentation, I popped a website on this slide here, australianwinediscover.com. So that's actually our education platform. We launched this a couple of years ago, and really it's the best go-to resource if you want to learn more about Australian wine. So on there we have 25 what we call modules. These cover the key grape varieties and the key regions. And there's also modules on broader topics like sparkling wine, old vines. There's one on organics and biodynamics, and so on. And within those modules, there's PowerPoints you can download, there's maps, there's videos, all sorts of information, and it's all totally freely downloadable and also fully editable. So you just can go to that website, register, and then it's all available to you. So if you want to learn more about Australian wine, please do take a note of that website because it really is an amazing resource. So today, as I said, we're talking about Riesling. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of Australia generally to kind of set the scene. Then we'll talk a little bit more about Riesling specifically through the Australian lens. And then we'll do a kind of deep dive into 4 of the key Australian wine regions for Riesling. So kicking straight in to Australia. I have to say this is a slide I use in almost all of my presentations because I think you can never emphasize enough just how big Australia is, because really the size of it is the key to why there is such diversity in Australia, both in terms of climates and topographies, in soil types, but also in terms of wine, in terms of wine regions, grape varieties and styles of wine produced. So Australia is the world's 6th largest country by landmass. It's the only island continent, and it's one of the most geologically and biologically diverse countries on the planet. It's home to snowfields, it's home to huge amounts of tropical coastline. You've obviously got the red bush desert in the centre. You've also got tropical rainforests. It's incredibly diverse in terms of climate. As you can see, size-wise, it really is bigger than Europe. It is a vast, vast country. To put some scale on this, if you flew from Perth over in Western Australia to Sydney across in New South Wales, that's a 5-hour flight. It's about 2,000 miles, and you'd be crossing 3 time zones. So it's a similar distance to flying from London to Cairo. So it really is a vast country. To put it another way, another useful fact, if you know, for a pub quiz at some point in the future, Australia is actually bigger than the moon. Now I say that, it sounds a bit crazy, but the diameter of the moon, so across the moon, is about 3,400 kilometers, and Australia at its widest point, west to east, is about 4,000 kilometers. So just again, something to keep in mind just about how big Australia is, because it does have such a key influence on the diversity across Australia. So huge region, a huge country, sorry. So as you might suspect, there's quite a lot of wine regions, 65 in fact. Don't worry, there isn't a quiz at the end of this. There's probably only about 20 of these wine regions that we typically see on bottles in export markets, I'd say. Quite a number of the smaller ones you tend to only see in Australia itself. And as you can see, they're predominantly around the southern part of Australia. And that's really because of the influence of the Southern Ocean. Now, if you flipped Australia into the North Hemisphere, it actually doesn't occupy the same part of the planet as Europe. It's much closer to the equator. So it really occupies the same part in the Northern Hemisphere as the very southern part of Europe, the Mediterranean Ocean, but really predominantly it's the northern part of Africa. So it is relatively close to the equator. But that's not to say the climate in Australia is the same as those parts in the Northern Hemisphere. And that's because climate is not just influenced by latitude, there's also other influences. In Australia, the key moderating influence is the Southern Ocean. So right off the south of Australia is the Southern Ocean. It's a very cold ocean. All the water comes up from Antarctica. So it really moderates the climate around this southern part of Australia, cooling it, and also all these cooling ocean breezes you have coming off the ocean. So this is the reason why you have all these wine regions, particularly near the coast, around the southern coast of Australia. It's also the reason why Tasmania is very much the coldest region in Australia, because it's totally bathed in those cold waters of the Southern Ocean. So 65 wine regions in Australia. About 40 of those actually grow Riesling. I'm not going to be talking about 40 wine regions tonight, don't you worry. We'll just talk about the 4 key ones. But Riesling is grown in 40 of the regions there. Yes, so 65 wine regions, and Australia is a vast country, but it's actually only got 146,000 hectares of vineyard. Now that might sound like a lot, but that's only about 4% of global plantings. Or to put it another way, it's about the same amount as Bordeaux and Burgundy put together. So I think many people tend to think of Australia as a huge producing country in terms of wine, but it's really not. It only produces about the same amount of wine, or has the same amount of vineyard area, I should say, as Bordeaux and Burgundy put together. It's just, it is a vast country with a vast number of wine regions. And so I think the preconception is that it perhaps has more vineyard area than it actually does. So turning to Riesling. Riesling's got a long history in Australia, but I think like Riesling in many other parts of around the world, it's had its highs and lows, shall we say, on its journey. And I'll go through the history a little bit more detail next. But today, Australia is one of actually the world's top producers of Riesling. Production figures about the same as the US. So it sits in second place with the US, ahead of France, actually. It produces more Riesling than France does. But obviously Germany is in the #1 spot. So it doesn't make as much Riesling as Germany does, but about the same amount as the US. So the history of Riesling in Australia. We're not entirely sure when the first Riesling went out to Australia. Some people say James Busby took it out in 1833, but the first official recording was actually with William MacArthur, another Scotsman, who brought it into Australia in 1837. William MacArthur was quite an important person in the early history of Australian wine, because not only did he bring in cuttings, he also then worked to propagate those cuttings onto bigger vines and then sell more cuttings across Australia. So he was one of the people that really helped wines spread to different regions across Australia. And Riesling in those early days was really embraced by immigrants from Silesia. So Silesia is a historical region in Central Europe that now encompasses Germany, the Czech Republic, and Poland. And quite a lot of people from that part of Europe went out to Australia in the sort of early 1800s, and they planted actually quite a lot of Riesling at the time. So there was one man who you may have heard of called Johann Gramp, So he immigrated from Germany over to Australia, settled in South Australia, and planted his first vineyard in 1840 in what is now the Barossa Valley. And he then actually wrote back to his family and friends in Germany and asked them to send specifically more cuttings of Riesling, which he planted at his estate, which was along the banks of Jacobs Creek. And that is where the Jacobs Creek winery got its name. He was the man who set it up. And it's really why Riesling is or was one of Jacobs Creek's most important wines. And then there was another man called Joseph Gilbert. He was English, actually, and he planted the first vineyard up in the Eden Valley, so much higher altitude, cooler climate, and Riesling, and that is what is now the Pusey Vale vineyard. And by the mid-1800s, Riesling was really highly in demand in Australia. It's the sort of the wine most people wanted to drink. And then a few decades later, by the 1930s, there was the first kind of innovation or first revolution in terms of winemaking. And it was refrigeration, really turned things around in terms of making Riesling, because for the first time, winemakers could actually influence how long they could ferment the Riesling for, and keeping it cool meant they could keep all the aromatics in the wine and keep that freshness. So that was a really important thing that happened in the 1930s. And then in the 1950s, Colin Gramp, who's actually the great-grandson, I think that was, right, of Johann Gramp, invented cold pressure fermentation. So again, keeping it cold, but keeping the fermentation under pressure, again, helped keep those aromatics in there. But that layer of carbon dioxide that stayed on top of the ferment meant you didn't get any oxidation. So again, keeping that freshness in the wine. So that was another revolution that really helped Riesling kind of move forward in Australia. And by the 1960s, it again was really a very, very important grape variety in Australia. There was a white wine boom at the time, and everyone was drinking Riesling, or they perhaps thought they were, because it was a time when what is said on the label was not necessarily what was in the bottle. So you had things like Hunter Valley Riesling, which in fact was not Riesling at all. It was Semillon. It was just labeled as Riesling. But I think this goes to show just how important Riesling was, because people were calling anything Riesling because it was such an important grape variety. But then a couple of decades later, Chardonnay came on the scene. And suddenly, I think globally, this is not just in Australia, this is in all the export markets as well, everyone wanted Australian Chardonnay. And it wasn't that Riesling plantings necessarily declined at the time, it's just Chardonnay plantings absolutely skyrocketed and popularity just went through the roof. So today, Riesling accounts for only about 3,000 hectares of plantings in Australia. That's only about 2% of total plantings in the country. But it still is a very important grape variety, and particularly in some of the regions we'll be talking about today. So viticulture of Riesling. Now, there's some grapes, I'd say like Chardonnay, that people often talk about as, I suppose, a winemaker's grape variety, in that the winemaker can put so much impact, I think, on terms of the wine style, you know, be it oak or, you know, doing all sorts of things to the wine to affect the style and flavor of it. How I think about Riesling is, in fact, the exact opposite. I think it's more of a viticulturalist grape variety, because it really is one of those grapes that is so expressive of where it's grown and its site. It really kind of assumes the characteristics of its terroir, if you like, absorbs the environment where it's grown. So quite different to these sort of more winemaker grapes. It's a grape variety that typically grows really well in a cooler climate, but specifically a climate with cold nights to really keep that freshness, the acidity, but also those aromatic flavor compounds in the wine. So in terms of Australia, regions that work well tend to be ones which either have some sort of continentality, so you get cold nights because of that diurnal difference, or have that cooling influence due to ocean or altitude. And again, we'll talk more about that when we get into the regions themselves. So Riesling can be quite a vigorous grape variety, so it tends to grow best in relatively low fertility soils, which kind of naturally control that vigor. It's also a grape variety which tends to have quite tight clusters. And what that can mean is if you have quite a humid or damp climate, you can have problems with rot. Now, in terms of Australia, you've got places like the Clare Valley, which is actually a very dry climate in the growing season, because predominantly all the rain in the Clare tends to fall in winter or spring. Throughout the summer, there's very, very little rainfall. So they don't have any problems with rot at all, which is brilliant. It also means that it's a fantastic region for growing organically and biodynamically. But it does mean equally that they actually can't make botrytise style of Riesling, because they just don't have the right environment. So for that reason, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here, but anyway, people like Mount Horrocks, you might have heard of their cordon cut Riesling. So Mount Horrocks, based in the Clare Valley, makes a sweet wine, can't make a botrytise style because they don't have the right climate, but instead they make a cordon cut. So they literally go along and cut all the canes on the Riesling, so the grapes naturally raisin on the vine, and they use those grapes then to make the wine. Of course, there are other regions in Australia where you can have botrytis, places like Riverina, where the clue's in the name. There's quite a lot of waterways there in terms of rivers and streams and so on. So naturally they get botrytis in those regions. So they can make those more sweeter botrytise styles. And then in terms of Australia with Riesling, I think really the key thing in terms of, from a viticulturist point of view, is controlling the canopy. I said earlier how Australia is relatively close to the equator. And what that means is you always have this real sunlight intensity in Australia. There's no getting away from it. That's just part of what makes Australian wine Australian, and part of what means you always get this kind of flavour richness, and particularly in Riesling, I'd say. But because of this sunlight intensity, and because Riesling grape skins are quite delicate, it's very, very important from a viticulturist point of view that they sort of control the amount of sunlight that can get onto the grapes. So having some sort of shading in the canopy is very, very important. And generally the viticulturists will talk about trying to get some sort of dappled shade on the grapes. So a little bit of sunlight getting through to allow ripening, but not too much that you're getting any sunburn or too much harsh phenolics accumulating in those grape skins. And then in terms of winemaking in Australia, I think the classic style of winemaking for Australian Riesling is super easy, I was going to say, straightforward might be a better word. So predominantly hand-picked and then whole bunch pressed, because they really don't want any of those phenolics. They're looking for absolute purity in terms of the grape juice, just getting that lovely flavour intensity. And then fermented in stainless steel, low temperatures to get those lovely esters and aromatics in the wine, early bottling, and generally under screw cap. And that's really about as easy it gets, I think, in terms of winemaking. Of course, these days there are a lot of people playing around with things as well. You do get some winemakers playing around with a bit of extended skin contact. So getting a little bit of those phenolic flavors into the wine, just to add a bit of breadth and richness and weight. And we're also seeing some people playing around with some lees aging as well, or lees stirring, again, to add texture. And there's also some winemakers using old oak, both for fermentation and maturation. Again, not to add necessarily oak flavor, but again, just to add more extra weight and richness and creating a slightly different style. So there was quite a lot of experimentation going on as well. But I think the typical, I suppose, classic style is that more straightforward, pressed, fermented, bottled, really, and bottled under screw cap. And worth saying at this point that it was actually really the Clare Valley winemakers that made screw cap as important as it is today globally. There were early experiments with screw cap actually back in the 70s in the Eden Valley. Pusey Vale did quite a lot of winemaking or bottling under screw cap at that point. But at that time, consumers really just were not ready for it. So it never took off. And it wasn't until 2000 that 13 winemakers in the Clare Valley decided to band together and all bottle all of their Rieslings under screw cap. And that's really what changed things globally for screw cap. And suddenly, I think everyone else realized what a good thing it was for this style of wine. And now something like 98% of all white wine in Australia is bottled under screw cap. So quite incredible how in a very short space of time, really, a couple of decades, we went from no screw cap to 98% of wines in Australia, white wines in Australia under screw cap, and all down to these Riesling makers. Okay, so common Riesling styles in Australia. So as I've said, I think the key style really is this lean, dry, bone dry style, high acid, quite citrusy. But you are beginning to see more of this kind of slightly off dry, people playing around a little bit more with added weight, whether it be in terms of some more phenolic texture, some lees aging, or so on, or just adding a bit more residual sugar, and then also these dessert styles. But I think it is predominantly that bone dry style we tend to see out of Australia from across a number of regions. And then the other thing always worth remembering about Riesling, I think I touched on, is just how well it ages. I often think about these kind of three ages of Australian Riesling, or Riesling generally, I suppose. When it's bottled, it's so super fresh. You've got that really high acidity. And in Australia, you tend to always have this lemon and lime kind of citrus flavors. And then once you get to about 5 years old, that acidity just starts softening off a little bit. You begin to get a little bit more breadth on the palate, and you're beginning to get these kind of buttered toast, honey, lemon curd kind of flavors develop. And then at about 10 years old, again, that acidity tends to soften off a bit more. You're getting much more of these toast and honey, almost a bit nuttiness coming through as well. So, as Riesling ages, you really do get this quite difference in terms of complexity in the wine, with that acidity just driving everything through. Now, that's not to say that Riesling can only be aged for 10 years, because certainly, the best wines you could age for 20, 30 years quite happily. I remember when I was in Australia, must have been 4 or 5 years ago now, I was really excited, to be honest. I got to taste Pusey Vale 1974, I think it was. And it was one of those early wines that they bottled under screw cap, and it was just phenomenal. It was fully evolved, so it was very toasty, buttery, nutty, all of that stuff, but it still had this lovely spine of acidity running through it. So it was still totally alive, and it was just a fascinating wine to try. Very special, and just goes to show that A, Riesling evolves very well under screw cap, and B, you can keep it for a very long time. Okay, so Australian Riesling regions. As I said, there are about 40 regions in Australia that grow Riesling. But for the purposes of tonight, we're just going to focus on 4 of the key ones. So Clare Valley and Eden Valley being, I suppose, probably the 2 predominant ones, the 2 classic ones, both in South Australia. But then a couple of the more up and coming regions being Tasmania, and then Great Southern over in Western Australia. So first up, the Clare Valley. So Clare, as you can see, is due north of Adelaide. It's about a 2-hour drive due north of Adelaide. And the confusing thing here is that Clare Valley is in fact not actually a valley. Just to confuse you, it's actually a series of sort of north-south running ridges with valleys in between. But even the valleys themselves are elevated. So the whole of Clare Valley is at an elevation, which influences the climates. So the differences here on those valley floors, you're sitting at about maybe 200 meters in terms of altitude, but up on the hills, sort of between the valleys, you might be up to about 550, 600 meters. So quite a significant difference in elevation in the Clare Valley. And this is part of the reason why the Clare is known for its 2 main varieties, being Riesling and Shiraz, which you might otherwise not think as sort of classically in the same region together. And this is because the Shiraz tends to be grown down on those valley floors, which are obviously the warmer sites. And then the Riesling is grown up higher, up on those hillsides, on the higher sites, which are much cooler. And so this is why Riesling and Shiraz coexist very, very happily together in the Clare Valley. So the Clare has about 5,000 hectares of vineyard. Of that, about 1,000 is Riesling. So I said earlier, I think about 3,000 hectares is the total plantings of Riesling across Australia. So a third of it actually is in the Clare Valley. So Riesling is very, very important for the Clare Valley. And similarly, Clare Valley is very important for Riesling in Australia. So this is just another map. This is actually from our Gaia resolutions we've made. And this is all based on satellite imaging software. So the idea for this was so we as Wine Australia could really figure out where all the vineyards are specifically in Australia. So all these dark green that you can see on the map, those are actually where the vineyards are in the region. So as you can see, there are quite a lot in the Clare Valley, and they are predominantly towards the centre of the Clare. But hopefully you can just about pick out those north-south running ridges running down through the region there. So climate-wise in the Clare Valley, it's pretty continental, as hopefully you'll have seen from this one. We are a relatively far away inland, so therefore quite a continental climate. So it does actually get pretty hot in Clare Valley in the summer. 40 degrees is pretty standard, 35, 40 degrees on a summer day is quite normal. But because of this continentality and also because of this elevation, there's a huge diurnal variation. So you might be up at 35, 40 in the daytime, you're probably down in single figures at the nighttime. So really, really big diurnal variation. So in terms of the wine, obviously what that means is in the daytime, the grapes are getting pretty ripe, getting lots of flavor intensity. But as soon as the sun sets and that temperature plummets, ripening stops. And that really keeps the acidity in the wine and the freshness. So really important for the style, this specific climate in the Clare Valley. You do get some hot winds coming down from the north, but the predominant winds are actually some cooling breezes that come off the Gulf St. Vincent to the southwest, and they tend to come through in the afternoon. So again, they just help to slightly cool off those grapes in the afternoon, meaning they're not getting too hot. As I said earlier, it's a dry climate. The rain tends to fall in the winter. So throughout the summer, there's no issues in terms of humidity. So there's very little disease pressure. So as I said, it's a great region for growing organically. I think I've covered this all. So continental climate, large diurnal difference, and quite a variation in altitude between those valley floors and up on the hillsides. Soil types, there's actually 11 recognised soil types in the Clare Valley. Now this isn't unusual for Australia because Australia is such an old continent. Everything has been so eroded in the country in terms of soil types. So sort of diversity in terms of within wine regions is very, very typical. So quite different to wine regions in Europe. So 11 soil types across the Clare Valley. And generally, we're talking about 5 key kind of sub-regions in the Clare Valley, although none of these are officially defined. It's just the Clare Valley is the region. There's no official sub-regions, but people tend to talk about 5 distinct areas, being Oban, Watervale, Severn Hill, Polish Hill River, and Clare itself. Now, 2 of the, I think, quite interesting different soil types to talk about are Watervale and Polish Hill River, because they're both relatively high altitude within the Clare, 450, 500 meter kind of altitude, but quite different in terms of soil types. So Watervale, the winemakers often refer to as a soft rock site, because it's this classic Terra Rossa red topsoil over limestone, so limestone being the soft rock. And then Polish Hill River, on the other hand, is a hard rock site with this broken slate. And this gives quite differences to the wine that comes out of it eventually. Because Polish Hill River on that broken slate, it's actually very, very low in fertility. So the vines really struggle growing in this part of the Clare Valley. So that tends to mean you get small bunches, you get small berries, and you tend to get much more, I suppose, mineral-driven wines rather than fruit-focused. They tend to be quite lean. They also tend to be wines that age for a very long time because of this style. On the other hand, Watervale, this soft rock site, is actually much higher in fertility. So you tend to get more generosity in the wines. You tend to get more kind of fruit flavors, much more florality as well. So quite interesting to see. And just to show you what that looks like in reality, I've got this great photo from Jeff Grosset from Grosset Wines. So this is 2 of his wines, Polish Hill, which is obviously from Polish Hill River, and Springvale, which is from a Watervale site. And I think just looking at these bunches, you can really see those differences. So the Grosset, the Polish Hill from Polish Hill River, you can see it's got smaller berries, The overall bunch weight is clearly a lot smaller. And you've also got much yellower skin. The actual skin of the grapes looks quite different. Whereas the Springvale, the Watervale sites, so high in fertility, you get this much bigger bunch, bigger berries, and it's much greener. And I asked Jeff, why the difference in skin color between the sites? And he actually doesn't know. He just says that is what the site gives. He's got the same clones between the two sites. There's very little difference in elevation between the two sites. Winemaking is the same, when it comes to that side of things. But just this Polish Hill River gives this quite different look to the grapes themselves and the bunches. So I think that's a really nice picture just to really show the differences between these two sites within the Clare Valley itself. So this is just a nice view across the Clare. This was actually taken in spring. You can see it's all still very green, but I think it gives you an idea of just some of the topography in the Clare, the kind of rolling hills and the differences. This is actually taken up from sort of high up on one of those ridges. So we're looking down into one of the valleys here, looking pretty beautiful. But generally in terms of Riesling, I suppose what you could call the classic Clare style, you'd be looking at between 12 and 13% alcohol, totally bone dry, absolutely no residual sugar at all, low in phenolics. So these wines will all be made with just free run juice. They definitely don't want any phenolics in the wine at all. And in terms of flavor profile, very much that kind of lemon lime citrus and being very high in acid. Now we'll come on to Eden Valley next, but just quickly, I think the key difference is really between Clare Valley and Eden Valley. Typically, I think Clare tends to be a bit more powerful in terms of flavor intensity than Eden Valley, and it tends to also have sort of firmer acidity than Eden has. There's not a huge difference. I'm not going to lie and say, oh, there's massive differences between Clare and Eden Valley. But in general, I think Clare tends to be that slightly more powerful and slightly sort of firmer acidity, whereas Eden tends to be a little bit more floral and a little bit more mellower in terms of acidity. So moving south a little bit down to the Eden Valley. So as you can see, we're the Eden's sort of north-northwest out of Adelaide. It's about an hour's drive. And for anyone who isn't aware, the Eden Valley is part of the Barossa zone. So the Barossa Valley and the Eden Valley together form Barossa. So if you ever see a label that says Barossa on it, this is not so much with Rieslings, tends to be with Shiraz. It will be because grapes have been blended from between the Barossa Valley and the Eden Valley. So essentially they're kind of two sides of the same coin. But in a way, we've got the same thing here that we have with Clare Valley, in that the Eden Valley is not a valley. The Barossa Valley, on the other hand, is a valley. It's lower lying, it's definitely much warmer. But the Eden Valley is actually an elevated plateau. So it sits at a much higher elevation than the Barossa Valley. So, you can be down in the Barossa Valley and you're kind of looking up at the hills when you're looking up to the Eden Valley. So it's higher in elevation, much cooler therefore, and much windier than down on the Barossa Valley floor. So this is why the Eden Valley is particularly well known for Riesling, as well as Shiraz, whereas Barossa Valley is obviously much more well known for those bigger, fuller, richer, much more powerful red wines. So the Eden Valley has got just under 2,000 hectares of vineyards. About 600 of those are Riesling. So not as much Riesling as in the Clare Valley, but still quite a lot, and particularly for a region of that size. As I said, it is cool climate, again, because of elevation here. So we're sitting at anywhere from about 380 metres up to about 550 metres in the Eden Valley. So lower down towards the north of the Eden Valley, and then I'll move on to this map, and then towards the south of the Eden Valley is where you have those higher elevations. And the highest part of Eden is called the High Eden. So this is actually an official sub-region of the Eden Valleys, High Eden, and that's where your vineyards are sitting up at about 500, 550 metres. So quite high altitude, so much cooler, and these are very much the windiest sites as well in the region. So again, I think this map just shows you quite clearly how the Eden Valley is really not particularly widely planted. The Barossa Valley, on the other hand, is quite a lot of vineyards down there. So again, just to give you a difference, idea of the difference between the Barossa Valley and the Eden Valley, Eden picking dates tend to be at least 3 weeks later than down on the Barossa Valley floor. So again, just giving you an indication of the difference in temperature between the two areas, even though they're right next to each other. So as I said, so the Eden Valley, Mediterranean climate, so it doesn't quite have the continentality of the Clare Valley. So it won't get as hot in the daytime in Eden. It's probably more likely 30 degrees in the summertime, but it also won't drop as cold as at nighttime as in the Clare Valley. So you don't quite have that huge diurnal bit difference as you do in the Clare, which I think again impacts the style of wine produced in Eden, and is probably why you don't have quite as much power as you do in the Clare, and also why that acidity is a little bit softer in the Eden Valley. And I mentioned the altitude there. So soil types, again, you've got quite a lot of diversity in soil types in the Eden Valley. Much of it is actually well suited to dry land viticulture, so doesn't need irrigating, but there are some sandier sites as well in the Eden, which will obviously need irrigating, because again, it is pretty dry during the summer. So this photo, this is actually taken from Jacobs Creek Steingarten vineyards. This is their top vineyard for Riesling. This is taken at the end of the summer, as I think you can gather from the colours here. And this is actually from after harvest. You can just about see the vineyards and the vines are beginning to brown off there. But just to give you an idea of the topography in the Eden Valley, as you can see, there are lots of different aspects and topographies and so on. It is quite an interesting region in that sense. So as I sort of said in relation to Clare Valley, Eden Valley tends to be a little bit softer in acidity than Clare, and you do tend to have more florality, I find, coming through from Eden Valley Rieslings. You still have very much that lemon, perhaps not quite so much as the lime as the Clare, but certainly more of that floral notes and slightly softened acidity. But again, the wines from up in the Eden will be made very similarly to the Clare predominantly. So, you know, free run juice into stainless steel, fermented and bottled pretty young and released for sale. And again, these wines are, well, particularly the best wines from the region, are things that will age for decades. So that was the sort of two classic Australian Riesling regions. So next off, we'll move quite a long way south, off to Tasmania. So Tasmania, I think, is probably one of the most exciting wine regions in Australia at the minute. It's also the coldest wine region. As I said earlier, is totally bathed in those cold Southern Ocean waters. So really is a cold climate viticulture here down in Tasmania. Now, Tasmania is its own GI, so geographical indication or region, but people tend to talk about 7 different areas within Tasmania. Now, again, these aren't officially designated as subregions, but they're just ones people tend to talk about. So as you can see, there's 3 of these areas up in the northern part of Tasmania around Launceston. Then you've got down the east coast as another part, and then 3 out around Hobart down in southern Tasmania. And as you can see from this map here, you can't pick out too many of those little green spots for the size of Tasmania. It's about the same size as Switzerland, actually, as an island. There's not a huge amount of viticulture. It's something like about 2,000 hectares of total plantings in Tasmania. Now, to give that a little bit of comparison, I think here in the UK, I believe we're about 2,500 hectares. So not quite as much vineyard area in Tasmania as there is here. So I think the interesting thing about Tasmania is actually how little is exported. Something like 40% of all production of wine in Tasmania is actually drunk in Tasmania. And then another 55% is drunk on what the Tasmanians will call the Big Island, being Australia. And then the remaining only 5% is exported. So we don't really see very much Tassie wine over here, which I think is quite sad because I love the wines from Tasmania. But, you know, there's some fantastic wines from Tasmania. And I think for many people, if you think about Tasmania and wine, you're probably thinking about sparkling wine because there's some truly outstanding sparkling wine from Tasmania, on a par with anywhere else in the world, I would say. Some really fabulous stuff. But actually the reality is Tasmania produces more still wine than it does sparkling. I think it's about a 60-40 split in terms of still to sparkling. And of that still, there's obviously quite a lot of Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, unsurprisingly, because that's also planted for the sparkling wine. But there's also some Syrah and then Riesling, but not a huge amount of Riesling. I think it's only about 5% of their total production, but there are some really, really lovely Rieslings coming out of Tasmania. So climate-wise in Tasmania, as I said, it is pretty cold with, you know, all that cold Southern Ocean around it. In general, the northern part of Tasmania is a little bit warmer and the southern part is a little bit cooler. But on the other hand, the northern part is also a little bit wetter and the southern part is a little bit drier. So that can kind of equal each other out in terms of cloud cover, because you tend to get more cloud cover in the northern part of Tasmania and less in the south. So there is some variation, is what I'm saying, in terms of climate across Tasmania. Not a huge amount of variation in altitude. I mean, we do say here anything between 10 and 330 meters, but the reality is the vast amount of vineyards in Tasmania, kind of 80 meters and below, because when you're in a cold climate area, you really don't need to be planting altitude because you're getting even colder. So most vineyards are planted at relatively low altitude. Soil types in Tasmania are incredibly varied. You have everything from sandstone to volcanic soils to schist to clay to limestone. Again, it just speaks about the diversity of soil types in Australia. So there's not really any sort of one underlying story in terms of soil types. But again, I think this is the interest and the interesting part of it, and the diversity, and certainly where all the local viticulturalists and winemakers get excited. So nice photo of what Tasmania looks like for you. And it's a wonderful place to visit Tasmania because it really does feel very different to the rest of mainland Australia. It's much greener, you know, there's water everywhere, not just surrounding the island, but also in terms of, you know, rivers and lakes and streams and so on across Tasmania. It is beautiful. And I think you can see from this picture, you've got obviously lyre training here, which tends to be a training system you're using in a cool climate because it opens up the canopy. And the idea is to get more sunlight onto the canopy and particularly onto the grapes themselves. So again, this gives you an idea why this is such a cool climate looking at this vineyard. So in terms of Riesling and Tasmania, I think what you get here is this real bright crystalline fruit. And I also see that in Tasmanian Chardonnay. It seems to be a sort of a property almost of Tasmanian white wines, is this real crystalline nature, a sort of absolute purity to the wines. Really amazing. And then this racy acidity, which is quite different of acidity to, I think, particularly to Clare, which tends to be quite a firm acidity. Whereas you've got this kind of racy, quite exciting acidity in Tasmania. And just amazing fruit and flavour intensity you tend to get in these wines. But I think Tassie Riesling is one of those places where winemakers are beginning to experiment with different, I suppose, methods of winemaking, be it a little bit of lees aging to add a bit of richness, or perhaps even a bit of old oak, as I said before, just kind of breaking things, shaking things up a bit, breaking the mold from what they're doing in the more classic regions, or playing around wild fermentation and so on. And then for the final region we're going to talk about, so I'm just checking the time, making sure we're okay. We're going to fly about 3,000 kilometers west. So again, just emphasizing just how big Australia is, right across to Western Australia, to a region called the Great Southern. So this is actually a really big region. It's about 150 kilometers by about 100 kilometers. So unsurprisingly, there are sub-regions within it, as you can see: Franklin River, Mount Barker, Parongarup, Albany and Denmark. So a really, really big region, but only about 2,500 hectares of plantings here. So plantings themselves are quite sparse, as you can see from this image. So because it is such a huge region, you do get quite a big variation in terms of climate. So Denmark and Albany, obviously you get much more maritime climate, right on the ocean there with that Southern Ocean influence. Mount Barker and Parongarup a little bit further inland, so a little bit warmer. And then Franklin River being the furthest inland, most more continental in terms of climate, and it is the warmest. It is also the more elevated in terms of altitude. So you do get much more diurnal variation in Franklin River, whereas obviously down in Denmark and Albany, being on the coast, you don't really get that diurnal variation because you have this moderating influence of the ocean. So in terms of Riesling, it's really Franklin River, Mount Barker and Parongerup, where Riesling seems to be finding a really natural home down in Great Southern. So climate, as I've said, Albany and Denmark very much maritime, but it's the more continental climates where Riesling is sort of holding strong in Great Southern, in those Mount Barker, Parongerup, and particularly in Franklin River. There is some altitude variation, obviously down on the coast, very little in Denmark and Albany, but by the time you get more inland, you're getting some influence of altitude, sort of 200, 300 meters, which again is influencing that climate and giving you that diurnal variation. Soil types in the Great Southern. So in general here, the western side of Great Southern, so Franklin River, Denmark, Albany, and Mount Barker tend to have more gravelly soils, which are actually quite similar to what you get in Margaret River. So well-drained gravelly soils. And then Parongerup more towards the east, you tend to get more loamy soils, but not a huge amount of difference there. And sorry, I don't think I've got a photo of Great Southern. But in general, I think the Great Southern Rieslings, in terms of style, this is probably one of the regions where you do get people playing around most with kind of off-dry styles as well. But in general, in terms of flavor profiles, I always get this kind of citrus blossom coming through from Great Southern. So it's not kind of that real lemon and lime that you get in Clare and Eden. It is that more kind of blossom floral elements. But as well as that, you tend to get more of that kind of orange and mandarin citrus. So something perhaps a little bit riper even than you get in Clare and Eden. And then this slightly softer acidity as well. Really, really pretty wines from the Great Southern. And that's about it in terms of Riesling. But before we head on to the questions, I just wanted to let you all know about a new platform we just launched about 3 months ago called Australian Wine Connect. This is something we've launched particularly for the trade globally, basically to put the trade in contact with Australian wineries. It's a virtual, always on platform. We've got about, I think, 300 wineries on there now. And the idea is you can go on there, connect with wineries, start conversations, but it's also the place where we now hold all our events. Numbers of tastings are on there, varietal and regional explorations, all sorts of content is on there too. So again, it's a great place to go to if you want to learn a little bit more about Australian wine, or perhaps start talking to some wineries. So another one to be aware of. And I think that's it for me in terms of Riesling. Hopefully there might be some questions to answer. I think, Lydia, are you going to pop on?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Emma. I think that was brilliant. It just took me to Australia. I want to go now and visit. Whenever I see these images, I think it just transports you to the vineyard. But yes, we've had a few questions come through, so I'll just run through them in order. So you talked about the lyre training in Tasmania, which is great, sort of a cool climate and more open canopy. But Jeffrey has asked about what kind of training, trellising you might use for Riesling to minimise sunburn or in the sort of higher radiation places.
Yeah, so in the Clare, for example, they tend to use VSP, but in years where I suppose the more El Nino years, so where they have less rainfall, they tend to let the canopy kind of flop a bit, for want of a better word. Some call it a ballerina canopy. So essentially the top of the canopy kind of leans over and helps give extra shade to the grapes. But it also means in the La Nina years, so the years where you tend to get cooler, wetter years, you can keep the canopy much more constrained and get more sun onto the grapes. So that tends to be what they use in the Clare. So it's about knowing what your weather system is doing that particular year and then managing your canopy in the right way. But they are very, very careful, particularly in the Clare, I think, because they are that much further north and because they're very wary of any kind of phenolic influence in the grapes.
Brilliant, thank you. And there were quite a few comments. People really appreciated your look at how Riesling aged and the kind of evolution of flavors. And Sasha has asked, when Riesling ages, are sugar and acid levels actually coming down, or is this just a perception as the wine evolves?
It's just a perception, I think, predominantly. I'm trying to think, perhaps some of the acid might drop out a little bit as tartrates, but essentially it's just the perception of everything else kind of changing around it.
Brilliant. And kind of tied into that with about the ageability of Riesling, we've got a question about, does Riesling evolve better from a longevity point of view with botrytis or without?
Oh, great question. I don't think it would make any difference, to be honest. I think it's about the acidity really that is helping drive it. And obviously, generally with botrytis, that's concentrating everything. So not just sugar, but also acid. So this is why, some botrytized wines can last a very long time, but equally, dry Riesling can last a long time as well if it's got that kind of flavor extract as well as the acidity.
Brilliant. And Robert has asked, what's the alcohol allowance either side of the labelled ABV in Australia?
So in Australia, domestically, it's 1.5%. So it's the same as in the States. But for anything exported over here, it's 0.5%.
Okay, so if you bought it over in the UK, then it will be within 0.5 of that. Yeah. Brilliant. And Claire has asked, do producers aspire to styles seen in Europe or even other New World countries like Washington State or New Zealand? Or do you think they sort of go for the Australian identity?
I think many of them, particularly those who've been working for a long time in their sites, know what is best for their site and how they can best make use of it. And I think a lot of them now are more not necessarily looking elsewhere, but really looking at their site and how they can work with it the best. So a lot of people, like Grosset and Mount Horrocks and so on, have turned to organics and biodynamics and really trying to work their site as well as they can, rather than looking elsewhere. But I think I was on a webinar recently with actually a lot of the Clare Valley producers, and they were just saying how the world of Riesling producers, as in globally, is such a small family that they just seem to know each other. And I think they're not necessarily taking tips from each other, but they're very aware of what everyone is doing. And similarly, people in Germany are aware of what's happening in Australia versus what's happening in Washington State or wherever. And I thought it was a sort of lovely idea that all these Riesling producers are just, sort of friends really globally.
Yeah, I'd like to see that sort of community of wine lovers and makers across the world. Brilliant. Just a couple more. So I think in reference to the fact you're talking about the really gentle pressing, like hand picking and gentle pressing for phenolics, Patrick was asking about, do they use any of the press wine, or is it just free run juice?
So it depends on the producer, but if we're talking sort of the top producers in, for example, the Clare, they're definitely only using the free run. But having said that, I'll give you an example of someone like Grosset. So his Springvale and the Polish Hill, they're all just free run juice. But he also makes a wine called Alea, which some of you might know, which is actually very slightly off dry. It's got sort of 8-10 grams residual, so not enough that you taste it, but it gives it an extra breadth and body. And because of that, he does use a bit more of his pressing in that specific wine. So I think, again, it comes back to wine style more than anything else. And I think, particularly these people who are now playing around a little bit with some off-dry styles, or specifically going for that extra weight and body, they are using more of those pressings. So sort of two different styles, I think, more than anything else.
Brilliant. Just a couple, I think, and you mentioned it at the beginning, but I forgot the exact number. How many regions produce Riesling? Was it 60? 40. There we go. Okay, so a lot more than you think, but we've just focused on the top 4 this evening. And then a question that always, I think, comes up and is no sort of short answer, but perhaps you could just mention about any impact of climate change affecting Riesling producers in particular.
Yeah, I think probably most important in terms of Australia is access to water. So places like the Clare Valley, you know, I think at the minute they're limited on planting any more vineyards generally because they only have a certain amount of access to water. And again, this is why people are turning perhaps more to things like organic and biodynamic viticulture to try and use their water better, I think, more than anything else. So I think it's not so much as necessarily changing viticulture, although, you know, they're being very careful in terms of canopy management and so on, but it's about that knowledge of access to water and how, if they are applying it in terms of irrigation, when to apply it and, you know, how much and that sort of thing. On a broader scale, in terms of across Australia, there's certainly a lot more interest in the so-called alternative varieties or Mediterranean varieties. So varieties from places like southern Italy and Spain and Portugal and so on, because a lot of those varieties are very well suited to drier, hotter climates. And so a lot of people in places like Riverland and McLaren Vale and so on are now planting those sorts of varieties instead, perhaps, of the classic Chardonnay, Cabernet, Syrah, Shiraz.
Brilliant. So we'll see even more diversity coming from our huge Australia. And just two more questions, I think, with the time we've got. So just going back to, we just mentioned there's 40 regions that produce Riesling, but obviously we've kind of discussed the key ones and ones that you do get over in the UK, but are there any others sort of up and coming or perhaps lesser known that you particularly would recommend seeking out outside of Australia?
Canberra is a wine region where I visited the last time I was out in Australia, and I was just blown away by the Rieslings there. They were really incredible, very, very different to particularly Clare and Eden, much softer, much more floral, but they really had an identity of their own, you know, across all the different wineries that I visited, which was lovely to see. So definitely keep an eye out for Canberra Riesling. Sadly, again, it's a case of not very many come over here, so perhaps quite hard to seek out. But yeah, no, something that I'm definitely going to keep an eye on myself.
Brilliant. And then final one, Jürgen has asked, he says he usually drinks dry Riesling from Austrian and German producers. It's quite new to Australian Riesling. So are there any particular producers you can recommend? And I imagine you represent all of the Wine Australia producers, so it might be a little bit tricky, but perhaps if you think there's a few kind of classic contrasting styles to start with.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if we go through the regions we've just talked about, so from Clare, you know, absolute classic. When we talked about Grosset, Jeff Grosset's wines are absolutely amazing. You've also got Pikes, makes some amazing wines. Mount Horrocks, I talked about, Paulette's. I mean, to be honest, I think with the Clare, you can't really go far wrong. You know, it tends to be a region that's very much small winemakers, small wineries, and the Rieslings there are just outstanding. Eden Valley, Pusey Vale is the one that comes to mind. Some of my favourite Rieslings, their Contours particularly, they release some wines older. So Contours is always released with at least 5 years bottle age on it. So you're always getting already into that kind of second tier of Riesling age, which is lovely. Across in Great Southern, Franklin Estate makes some delicious wines. And then you've got Plan B as well, another one to look out for, because they specifically work with off-dry Riesling. That's the style they love. So, you know, another slightly different style, I suppose, but some delicious wines as well. That should be a few to keep you going.
Definitely. And you've definitely got my taste buds going. So brilliant. So we're right on time. Thank you so much, Emma, for all your insights, for, you know, virtually transporting us to Australia. And I loved some of the snippets of information about just how quite big Australia is and some of the comparisons to the moon. I'm going to remember those. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you to everyone that attended and all your brilliant questions. And the recording will be online from tomorrow.
Thanks so much, everyone. I hope you all have a good evening.
Thank you, Emma. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.